that's a real problem with my party. There's so much anger and angst, a need to protest this country's policies, especially Biden era policies. It was young people protesting Biden, claiming that America is horrible, right? And that we are the worst country in the world because of our different histories and things like that. And it's just like, have some perspective. We are still the envy of the world. We forget how good that is. We're still that shining city on the hill. We're still that beacon of hope. And we are still far better off than any other country in the world. And that's tough because, you can't get out of your own mind and your own mindset and your own neighborhood and your own set of struggles and, your own thoughts and fears of somebody, getting one up over you or fear of the other, what have you. But fundamentally, being born, you hit the jackpot when you're born in this country.
That is Kevin Walling, and this is a brand new episode of the Michele Tafoya podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe. We'd love to have you on board. It's free to subscribe. That way you never miss an episode, and we'd love to have you join our growing family. Kevin Walling has joined the small but growing family of Democrats joining the show. Dean Phillips was the first. Kevin's just the second. And we have a conversation about how to connect, how to cross the divide. But more interestingly, he talks about being a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat who married a staunch Republican. Yes. He talks about the problems within his own party and why Joe Biden remains his hero. This is all really interesting stuff from a very common sense, moderate Democrat. They do exist. Kevin Walling is our guest next. Hey, Kevin Walling, it's been a while. How are you?
Hey, Michelle, good to be with you. It has been a while, but it's good to see you.
Likewise. And as I told you off camera, you're just the second Democrat who has agreed to come on the show, with Dean Phillips being the first. And you said, well, Dean may have been right about a few things. So we're going to get into this with you. You are an incredibly reasonable human being. We don't agree on everything politically, but I do think we can find some common ground. But let's start with your leadership. And we found a soundbite, and actually I found it on your X feed, of Ken Martin talking about the People's Cabinet. So without further ado, I just want to run this and get your reaction on the other side. Misty, go ahead and roll that tape.
Hey, it's Ken Martin. I want to tell you about the People's Cabinet that the DNC is launching today. I have been traveling across the country nonstop since I started this job, and what I hear over and over is this: Americans want us to fight back against Trump's lies and offer a better alternative. Trump has stacked his cabinet with out-of-touch billionaires who are causing chaos and hurting working people. That's why we are launching the People's Cabinet. It will be made up of experts, leaders, and everyday Americans who will share reliable and accurate information that you can use to fight back. Stay tuned for more.
All right, so that's Ken Martin.
A fellow Minnesotan, of course, as well.
So what do you make of this idea?
Yeah, listen, I think, as we saw coming out of this, past weekend, there's a lot of energy in the grassroots, a lot of frustration with what folks are seeing in Washington with, this tariff battle and stuff like that. And I think there's a lot of confusion. The Democrats are still trying to think through how to navigate Trump 2.0, right? We're still trying to, and a lot of our energy is kind of falling on deaf ears, and we're getting attacked from the progressive left and the Bernie folks and the AOC folks that we're not doing enough. And then the moderate folks, and I'm in the moderate camp, I'm saying, I don't want to alienate, more moderate Democrats, many of whom want to see some common ground and work with the president where we agree, want to see us support, reasonable cabinet nominees and things like that. So I think Democrats are trying to figure out what our strategy still is for the midterms, how to harness this energy that we're seeing in the grassroots. And I think that's what, Chairman Martin's announcement with this cabinet, this People's Cabinet of experts, to answer a lot of the questions that are out there about what's happening with the economy and immigration and those kinds of things.
Well, he specifically used the term, we want to counter Trump's lies. And so, look, I think politicians of all stripes have an interesting relationship with the truth. So, a lot of it is to sell things. A lot of it is to persuade people, whatever it is. But what specifically are some of these lies that you think he's referring to? So when someone came to me and talked to me about sleep cream, I thought, what in the heck is this sleep cream? They said, do you want to sleep better? And I said, I do. I absolutely do. I need to sleep better. I don't sleep well. I don't want to take a pill. I don't want a prescription. So I tried sleep cream. It's an all natural CBD based topical that I apply at bedtime. I put it on the insides of my forearms and wrists and insides of my elbows. Some people put it on the bottoms of their feet, and lo and behold, it relaxes me and I'm allowed to sleep. My body is allowed to sleep. Don't just take it from me. Here is Diana R. Thank you for this product. I use the 3000, they're leveling different levels, on both of my arthritic knees to reduce pain. Surgery is not an option right now. This product is a godsend. Okay, so here's the deal. You can try it totally risk-free. Go to sleepcream.com, and it's CREME, sleepcream.com, CREME.com, and use the code GAMEDAY at checkout for free standard shipping on your first order. That's code GAMEDAY. If it doesn't work for you, listen, you're off the hook. They guarantee it. They stand by their product, but only if it works for you. All right? So there's no risk here. Sleepcream.com, code GAMEDAY. Sleep, CREME. If you're ready for your best night's sleep ever, sleepcreme.com. Use that code GAMEDAY at checkout for free standard shipping on your first order. What specifically are some of these lies that you think he's referring to?
Well, I think one of the big ones that we've seen in recent weeks, especially with the tariff fight, and he's been somewhat at odds with, for example, Steve Bessent, his own Treasury Secretary, and Republicans in the Senate and the House, who have said that the American consumers, American people will pay the cost of the tariffs. And the president has been out there saying that, foreign companies pay those tariffs when they reach our shores. In a way to kind of spin the narrative around what we're seeing with the stock market and things like that. So I think, Ken's, insistence on putting some of those experts to counter that narrative is one of the big ones that we're seeing with the economy right now. I hate, and to your point, Michelle, we're in total agreement. People love to call each other liars, and each side says that all the time.
All the time.
And, what is truth anymore? And I think that's part of the problem in our day-to-day lives where, you have a set of beliefs, I have a set of beliefs, and then we go find news outlets and people that support those outlets on both sides that support those viewpoints. And there's certainly a level of frustration out there with the American people trying to cut through some of that noise and what is the actual reality that we're all experiencing.
I'm currently re-listening to Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and it's a terrific book. And it reminds you that this is nothing new, right? That there have been biased newspapers from the beginning of time.
Oh my God. Literally run by the parties,
run by the
Republican
parties.
Party and the Democratic Party back then had their own news outlets.
Exactly. So they would describe a Lincoln speech in two totally different ways. That Lincoln, for instance, getting into the Lincoln-Douglas debates, how Lincoln was dragged off that Douglas wiped the floor with him. And then the other side would say Lincoln was carried off on the shoulders of all those supporting him. So it's amazing to me that but I think the difference now, Kevin, is that news travels so much faster, that it's not just in print, that we're getting it every moment. Like you and I are watching the stock market. We're watching these phone calls that are reportedly coming into the White House about tariffs. And all of this is shaping things immediately. And, it's kind of everyone's has these knee-jerk reactions to everything. And then we have a place to spout them, whether it's on X or Threads or wherever you like to spout. Exactly. So I think that fuels this immediate sort of friction. Currently it even exists, like you said, in your own party, where you've got a really strong progressive wing. And then you've got moderates who I think are by and large being ignored by the media. How do you deal with that?
It's a really, really good question. I think, I love that you pointed out the Doris's book. And I think, I love history, and I think we all need to spend a little bit more time. We always think this is the most divided era in our history. We fought a civil war, we fought a civil rights battle. We, we always like to harken back to Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. And yes, they had a fundamental, decent friendship and love of America and patriotism, but they were going to war all the time on Social Security and all kinds of different things and battling it out. And again, we always think this is the most divided era. And I wish we just would spend a little bit more time thinking about the history of this country, and that those factions are not a bad thing, in terms of, minority majority rule and pushing back on different ideas and things like that. There was a Washington Post article not too long ago about, the left wing of my party and Justice Democrats and the Progressive Caucus versus kind of the New Dems, moderate wing of the party. And when it was the New Dems winning these primaries, my moderate Democrats, and that's what I am, we were winning general elections over the Justice Democrats. So those majority makers in a lot of those districts that Trump won, if I've got a moderate Democrat, I'm going to win that race, over that Justice Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And
you know what? I don't think I've heard the term Justice Democrat before. What?
It's another term for it's a whole thing out there. And
climate justice.
It's the
social
AOC kind of wing of the party.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of energy, and that's great in Brooklyn, New York, where that's the ideology there. But, in a lot of these districts that are moderate districts, that is not going to resonate. And, why I spend so much time on Fox News is there's a whole lot of people out there that message isn't going to resonate to. And there were 12 million plus Americans that voted for Barack Obama once or twice that then voted for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And when I first started on Fox, and we've got to make a concerted effort to win those folks back. And we can't shut those folks out, and we can't talk down to those folks. So that's part of, I think one of the solutions to my party is we screwed up so much in this election. We can talk more about that too, where we talk down to people. We lecture people all the time, and it's crap. It really is. And it alienates people.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's actually been happening longer than just in this last cycle. I actually think part of the reason Trump was successful even back in 2015, 2016 election was because he gave people permission to push back against the lecturing. We've been lectured to by the left for a long, long time about social issues and the rest, and being empathetic and all of these things, acting as though conservatives aren't empathetic, or we're not curious or generous or care about people. And I think a lot of people were tired of hearing that. And finally, someone even more crass came across the line and said, I'm going to break all this down and you're free to say what you want. I think that communication had a lot to do with it, but I digress. Getting to where we are now, and for your party, it's a really interesting time. And you're right that there are factions, just like there were during the Tea Party movement for the conservatives. This stuff happens all the time. But one of the things I think that, and it's a hill that I'm prepared to die on, is the gender ideology, not only in sports, but in Colorado. They just passed a bill that if you misgender your child, that could be used against you in a custody battle, this stuff about children. And, it's better to have a live daughter than a dead son kind of rhetoric. And the state intervening where parents really should be playing the primary role. Sure, there are instances, and I'd say they're in the minority, where parents aren't doing a good job. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, parents should be the first line of defense between their kids and anything else. So why is that such a big issue for the left?
It's a really good question. And we're in agreement on that front. Listen, and I think maybe one of the times we were on Outnumbered together, we were covering a great hearing on Capitol Hill that featured, parents of trans kids, members of the trans community, but then also advocates on the other side. And it was a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And it was a Republican committee hearing, and it was literally trying to just kind of have a conversation about this issue. And anytime the state is trying to put themselves in between, a parent and their child, we're going to lose. And that is detrimental to that child. Now, to your point, there are certain cases where, because of the child's safety, right?
Sure.
We've got to protect that child from that parent. But the vast majority of parents want their children to grow up to be successful in a loving environment, regardless of their orientation or their
Exactly.
gender identity, and
Yeah.
are supportive of that. And I think so much of this community, especially the community that is so performative too, right? That we think we know better than what these parents do in these communities. And I think, and you've spoken about this oftentimes on your podcast and other conversations, it's a common sense issue, right? Women and girls in sports. I'm all about, let's create a separate trans league, right?
Sure.
Where, trans kids can compete against one another in different states or different counties and communities and things like that. But you've got to protect women and girls.
Yeah, you do.
Right. And again, we're champions of women and want women to succeed. We Title IX and all, and again, to not, again, we've lost any semblance of common sense with some of this stuff. And, we talk about 80-20 issues all the time. We can't continue to be, in the 20% on these issues.
You have such a fascinating personal story as well, and I want to get into that in a minute. But first, I do want to touch on some of these books that are being published lately now that
Sure.
people are suddenly coming clean about Joe Biden and how he was or was not capable. And I think this is where trust factors in. That all of these people who said Joe Biden is as sharp as they come, you don't want to hear it, on Morning Joe saying he is as sharp as a tack, as the best version of Biden we've ever seen. And then the debate. But we knew before the debate. I mean, we all saw the signs, Kevin. Why did the Democrats insist that everything was just hunky-dory with Joe Biden?
Yeah, and these books are coming out, and I think we're going to grapple with this. And I was a Biden guy. I was a surrogate for him in 2020. I grew up in New Jersey and Delaware, and he was my hero, and still is. And certainly he was past his prime. I think in 2020 he was likely the only Democrat that could have beaten Donald Trump. It's very hard to beat an incumbent president. And I think we and his team around him lost sight of the idea. Number one, it's also when you're president, it's real. I think Franklin Pierce, back to the 1800s, as we study history, was the last person to willingly give up seeking a second term. And I think he was so, from a greedy perspective almost, that he was the only one in his mind that could do it again. And that the vice president couldn't do it, and there weren't other Democrats that could do it, that he was the singular person, because he'd done it in 2020, that could do it again. And it was to our detriment, because you can't argue against optics, right? And I'd spent a lot of time with the president at events over those 4 years. And there were days that were the Joe Biden, from 20 years ago when I knew him and I worked for the other senator from Delaware. And there were other days when he was struggling. And that's the case at 78, 79, 80, which was his years in the White House. Again, it's tough, because I think that's going to be one of the, obviously he's the bookend between both Trump eras. And he's got an incredible legacy of legislative achievement in those 4 years, half of them with a Republican Congress, right? Where he was able to, the government never shut down any of those 4 years. Right, able to pass great bipartisan bills too, when it came to infrastructure, when it came to guns, when it came to marriage equality, other things. So that is all tainted through the lens of losing re-election and not setting up his legacy for success and turning the keys back over to Donald Trump.
Well, Kevin, I know you were a surrogate for the Biden-Harris campaign. I know that you've said here that he's your hero, but there are a lot of there's a lot of smoke that could be from fire, around his son's dealings with international companies and so forth. So it's interesting for me to hear you call him that he's still your hero. What makes him your hero? What, and is there anything, do you think that he's done that was his own? He brought it on himself, some of this damage.
Certainly, he brought it on himself. We're all flawed, right? We're all ambitious. This is a guy, again, who first ran for the presidency in the 80s, right? He's an ambitious guy, got elected at 29 before he could even take the oath of office, right? He had to turn 30. But again, I think, I go back to, being a student of history and loving Team of Rivals and stuff like that. It harkens back to an age. This is a guy who gave Strom Thurmond his eulogy, right? Segregationist. I now claim South Carolina. My husband's from South Carolina. When you grow up in New Jersey, you want to claim any other state. So I'm a South Carolinian now. This is a guy who built these relationships with men and women of such opposing ideology. And it harkened back to this America first patriotism, not nativism, but that this was country first, right? His closeness with John McCain, his closeness with Pete Domenici, other senior Republicans, and the ability through sheer force of will, to overcome enormous tragedy in his life, to wake up every morning, to commute on that train, to deliver on all these kinds of legislation, for 50 plus years, to serve the first Black president of the United States with grace and humility, right? Not an easy job either, right? Handing over the spotlight completely and becoming second fiddle from being your own fiddle for 40 years. I think he's still, and again, we can, talk about Hunter and all that kind of stuff, but to also not forsake his son throughout all of this too, even with all the screw ups and all of the pain that Hunter has caused that family because of his addiction and all of the things that he did overseas and all of the wrong that he has done. It's incredible to me still. And again, in history, we'll see how history judges him over those 4 years. And I can go on about all of the accomplishments of those 4 years, but because of his sheer personality to deliver, to work with John Cornyn, right? Republican, he might now face a primary challenge in Texas because of his ability to work with him on comprehensive gun control that we hadn't seen in 20 plus years in the wake of Uvalde, because of the way that Joe Biden, just his own kind of character, that these guys every day, and I spent a lot of time with Kevin McCarthy in green rooms, right? Every day he's talking about how terrible, Joe Biden is, but they could actually negotiate and kept the government open, and it cost him his speakership. But the ability for them to transcend politics to some degree, harken back to some semblance of what patriotism was back then, that we're still grappling with.
Yeah, we sure are.
And I see it, and one of the beautiful things that I see and I love is a relationship with Hakeem Jeffries and Mike Johnson, right? Speaker Johnson and the Democratic leader in the House. There's a semblance of that still, right? Where they, and they talk about it all the time. They disagree on everything, but there's fundamental respect, and that's what we got to get back to.
We have to, and I don't think that you probably get to see more of that behind the scenes than the public gets to see, and that's unfortunate because all we see is people beating up on each other, in the press and on X and all the rest. And that's what people see. And it's like, I remember interviewing Laura Bush one time, and she said, the difference is that we all used to live in DC and we were neighbors and we go to each other's house for dinner and cocktails. And now everyone just commutes and no one talks to each other. No one is friendly. No one lives, there's no community.
Nobody knows one another within Democratic on the same side, even to say nothing of knowing folks on the other side of the aisle. Yeah. There's Sheila Simon, who was once the lieutenant governor of Illinois. Her dad, Paul Simon, the longtime senator from Illinois, the guy with the bow ties in the 80s, he ran for president. She went to Bethesda High, because she grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland, because her dad was in the Senate, and all of her close friends were other kids of senators and House members. And they were all over, to your point, at each other's house for barbecues and things like that. Republicans and Democrats, it didn't matter. And that's what's lost now.
Yeah, do you think we can get back there?
I think so. I think what it's going to take is some existential threat from abroad, We saw it in the wake of 9/11 with Republicans and
And that
Democrats. God
lasted
bless
about
America.
5 minutes. That's what's so frustrating about that one,
No,
Kevin.
no.
I thought after 9/11 that we were, everyone came out on the Capitol steps, they sang,
It was
and
beautiful. Yeah.
then it was poof, it was gone.
Yeah. I mean, I still see it in the Senate, and Brett Baer has a great Common Ground segment, every week or so with House and Senate, mostly Senate members, some House members. I think we got to do more codels, which is when members of Congress travel overseas to our military bases or junkets overseas, because we've got to bring that back.
Yeah.
And I'm encouraged, when I see John Fetterman, going to Mar-a-Lago or having those meetings, and Marco Rubio unanimously confirmed to
Yes.
Secretary of State from his Democratic colleagues as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to hold up, again, to your point, the incentive structure in the media is just, you're a liar. And the more that we can, and it's not sexy, but the more we can talk about where folks find common ground, the better.
It's it's not sexy, and that's true. It's like, I love that Brett Baer does those common ground segments. I do. And I just hope other people are listening. It's there's so much, Kevin, that we could get into, but to me, you dropped a little nugget of information I wasn't aware of before we got on camera together. And I got to get into this because you talk about bipartisanship.
Yeah.
You married a Republican.
I did.
And not just your average Republican. This is someone who's deeply committed. So first of all, how did you meet?
So we met on Tinder. So my husband, Alex Stroman, grew up in South Carolina politics. His grandfather was very close friends with Strom Thurmond. So as a kid, he spent a lot of time with Strom, and
wow.
Ran a bunch of different races in South Carolina, was the youngest executive director of the Republican state party down there. Then came to Washington, worked at the Republican National Committee, ran their comms department with Sean Spicer.
My goodness.
And their surrogates program, moved into Trump Tower during the 2016 election, and was at every debate in support of then candidate Trump. And then worked for the inaugural committee and was the committee spokesperson for President-elect Trump's inauguration. So this is a tried and true Republican. I thought
that would be a deal breaker from the start. What? So
yeah.
Why did that not get in the way? Or is this one of those opposites attract kind of things?
So he's got great hair. He's a great singer. He's a great dancer. He cooks well. So that supersedes all of the, silly conservatism that he has. But but again, I think we've got to return to that, where all these Pew studies and stuff like that, where, more and more, that not even where people live or what they do, but it's more that the number one point of disagreement, especially for parents with their children, right, is marrying and dating someone from the opposite party.
That's
right?
crazy.
That is like the number one anti-thing out there. And I think that's wrong, because again, when we just retreat and we just talk to everyone who believes the way that we believe, and it's wrong. And
we don't learn, we don't grow.
Yeah. And he helps me so much. And, when I'm on Fox every day, every other day, he helps me with, how to talk about this. And, I joke that, when I'm co-hosting The Five and I'm next to Judge Janine, sober Judge Janine, next to me is drunk Sandra Stroman, my mother-in-law, at the dinner table with her ideas, so, but that's the way, we got to get back to.
Well, it still fascinates me because you're right. There's so much part of the family fabric that is built around values. Mm-hmm. And values are really, I think, at the core of someone's political beliefs, I think. So obviously you guys share some values and you're able to coexist in a marriage where you're politically, I don't want to say you're diametrically opposed, but, how do you navigate that? Do you just not talk about politics? Obviously, you said he's helping you with your presentation on Fox, but how do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, I think it number one, and I think this is helpful writ large to everybody. It comes from a fundamental place of respect, right? So these aren't Johnny come lately ideas in terms of what we believe and what we think about. So we've done the work, we put in the hard work on campaigns and researching, and this is fundamentally what we've experienced and through life experience have come to believe. So that level of respect, I think, trumps everything. And that, he's not going to ever change me and I'm not going to ever change him. But we can meet somewhere in the middle on a lot of different issues. And that's the happy medium. One of his, very dear friends is Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders from Arkansas, who,
sure.
They work together at the RNC, and we've been, and they're dear friends. And I disagree fundamentally with, Governor Sanders on a lot of things, but when you get to know her as a friend, she's a lovely, caring, wonderful person. And I might get a lot of grief as a Democrat saying that, but that's what we've also got to return to.
I respect the hell out of that.
Yeah, we can
Because
disagree without being disagreeable, and I'll fight her on, XYZ on a bunch of different things, but I'll also praise her when she raises teacher pay, and in Arkansas, and takes that head on, and to make Arkansas competitive, and when she attracts new businesses, especially aerospace and those kind of investments in the state. But we'll disagree on a bunch of other stuff too.
Sure. But the fact that you are family friends, and it's just it's rare. I'll tell you where I find it, Kevin, is at the baseball park.
Yeah,
my son's been playing baseball since he was tiny. He's now a Division III player in college, as a freshman.
That's cool. Where does he play?
He plays at Carleton here in Minnesota.
Cool. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I know a lot of the parents of his teammates are on the opposite side of the aisle from me. I know that. But when we go to a baseball game, we're just cheering about the score,
you got a singular focus.
We got a singular focus.
Yep.
And we love each other's kids like they're our, not like they're our own, but we cheer for them. We support them. We want them to do well in this group effort. And we want them all to get along no matter what. They're teammates. There's something bigger. It's the team.
Exactly.
And in the case of the United States of America, it's the country, and we all want it to succeed. And I think though that part of the problem is that the idea of success, and this is where Doris Kearns Goodwin's book is so relevant right now. It's such a dramatic rift right now, such a deep rift between what is good for the country and what isn't. And I just wonder if the divide is really that deep, and how are we going to bridge it? That is the big question for me. How are we going to bridge it? Do we all just start going to baseball games together, or what do we do?
Maybe that's part of it. I think the universal thing is, the universal uniter is, we all want our children to be better off than we are.
Absolutely.
And we can disagree about how to achieve that, and what tax policy is better and what education policy is better, and all of that to achieve that. But I think that as a starting point is important, and meeting folks where they are on that journey is important. And again, I think we all need to also, in addition to reading these great history books and stuff like that, is talk to folks overseas. One of our good friends is a guy named Joe Hockey, and Joe was the Australian ambassador to the United States back during the Trump administration, round one. And he was involved in came up through Australian government and was their treasurer. And, he wrote a book a few years ago, and he, at his book talk, spoke about just American greatness, and that, what we often lose sight on is just how great America is.
Yeah.
And it's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing. We are still the envy of the world. And we forget how good that is. We're still that shining city on the hill. We're still that beacon of hope. And we are still far better off than any other country in the world. And there's nowhere else, any of us should ever want to live. Maybe Ireland for me. But nowhere else besides Ireland, as this proud Irishman, would want to live. So again, that's part of it too, is that just some realization. And that's tough because, you can't get out of your own mind and your own mindset and your own neighborhood and your own set of struggles and, your own thoughts and fears of somebody, getting one up over you or fear of the other, what have you. But fundamentally, being born, you hit the jackpot when you're born in this country.
It's amazing to hear that from you.
And I wish more Democrats had that mentality. That's a real problem with my party is that, and especially we saw it on these college campuses, right, where there's so much anger and angst, and a need to protest this country's policies, especially Biden-era policies. It was young people protesting Biden, claiming that America is horrible, right, and that we are the worst country in the world because of our different histories and things like that. And it's just like, have some perspective, have some reality. You can be a student of history. We got a lot of things wrong. A lot of people in this country, we were 3/5 of people back when we started, but we've come a long way.
We've come a long way, and we need to celebrate the progress.
Yes.
But
yes, for 250 years.
There's a tendency to just keep going back and picking the scab and
Correct.
and claiming that that's who we remain, and it is not who we are today.
Correct.
Oh, Kevin, it's been really nice talking to you, and I hope people can take away what from this, that not only can you and I talk, but you and your husband can share marital bliss and a family together on you're kind of like Mary Madeline and
James Carville with better hair.
James Carville with much
we argue
hair.
all the time, but never about politics.
I'd love to have you back, Kevin, because there's a lot to discuss, a lot of problems to solve, and I think a lot more bipartisanship would help the matter.
We didn't even get to talk about the great conversation you had with my buddy Doug Collins, the VA secretary.
And see, he's your friend. He's my friend.
Good buddy. And I think the world of him. And
he's a great
that's
dude.
Another one where we'll disagree like crazy. But I think he's doing a heck of a job at the VA. He's a colonel, and he's getting a lot of grief for all the attacks that he's getting incoming with people that don't know what is actually up at the VA, and they're making all these assumptions. And this guy is a guy that spent 30 years in the Air Force doing the right thing. So
he cares about his vets, and he'll do anything for them. And instead he's being vilified by people who again are willing to lie to get their message out there that is fake news.
Exactly. But I'd love to be back.
We'll do it again. He is Kevin Walling, and you can find him on X, and you can see him on Fox quite a bit, which is where we met. And I'm so glad to include him in this podcast, and we will do it again. In the meantime, folks, as I always say, be brave, do good, and we will see you next time. Hey, you can keep up with the Trump administration when you subscribe to the Trump Report. It's an email that brings you daily highlights from the Oval Office right to your inbox 5 days a week. Subscribe today at SalemPodcastNetwork.com/Trump.